Canada's big pivot, beyond the US. Canada, once America's closest trade ally, is turning its back and finding new partners. It's not about feelings. It's about punishing tariffs from Washington, broken trust, and lucrative deals signed across the ocean. While the US focuses on its trade wars, 7 countries you've barely heard of in connection with Canadian exports have quietly stepped in to take its place. Some of those names you could probably guess, others you won't believe. And if you miss the very last name, you'll miss the clearest clue to a global power shift that's rewriting the rules of the world economy. 1. The United Kingdom, a golden rush. Meet Sarah Chen, a gold trader at the Royal Canadian Mint. Just 6 months ago, she was exporting about 2 containers of gold each month to London. Today, Sarah is coordinating up to 17 shipments a week, a volume even the internal logistics software was never designed to handle. Canada has increased its gold exports to the UK as British refiners race to secure supply outside the traditional US network. The numbers don't lie. While the US services trade surplus with the UK reached $2.22 billion in April 2025, Canadian gold exports to the UK have risen 340% since February, according to Statistics Canada. Gold producers and refiners in the UK, still dealing with post-Brexit supply chain chaos, see Canadian suppliers as more reliable than European options, which are facing raw material shortages and complicated customs procedures. But there's one thing Sarah doesn't know. The Bank of England is quietly concerned about this sudden reliance on Canadian goods. Leaked internal memos show that financial officials in London worry that if Canada experiences disruptions, from port congestion and power outages to strikes, their entire gold supply chain could be shut down within just a few days. The pressure is growing. Just one delayed container could break a futures contract worth hundreds of millions of pounds. In an online meeting, Sarah has started to hear a different tone from her British partners, not just words of thanks, but also pressing questions about contingency plans if Canada's infrastructure becomes overloaded. Every shipment feels like we're writing history, Sarah told a colleague at the Port of Vancouver, where gold containers are sealed under tight security. But sometimes history doesn't just set records, it breaks things. Sarah is about to find out that these new relationships are so fragile, just one headwind could turn the whole story upside down. 2. France, timber and trust. Back at the port of Halifax, loading supervisor Michelle Dubois watches rows of containers stamped with Lavi, the identifier for timber and machinery bound for Laval, France. Michelle has worked at this port for 23 years and has never seen a scene like this. The container yard is packed to the brim, cranes are running around the clock, and warning horns are sounding almost non-stop. The trade deficit with France jumped from $244 million to $3.9 billion in March after French importers suddenly discovered Canadian suppliers they had overlooked for decades. According to Export Development Canada, French manufacturers have signed 3-year contracts for Canadian lumber, machinery, and agricultural products. The CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, had already eliminated 98% of tariffs, but it wasn't until the US-Canada trade war erupted that these sleeping provisions truly came to life. "We're loading faster than the paperwork can keep up," Michelle explained to government inspectors as a forklift carrying a pallet of lumber rolled by. The French even sent customs officials directly to Halifax to speed up clearance. Yet, the volume kept climbing. Over time, costs at the port have tripled compared to last year. Workers are pulling 16-hour shifts, eating quick sandwiches while waiting for cranes to unload cargo. Internal documents from the Port of Halifax show the current infrastructure wasn't built to handle this level of trade with Europe. There are too few rail lines inside the port, not enough cold storage, and the container management system is temporarily running on backup servers to avoid crashing. But Michelle has no idea that in Paris, the story looks different. Inside closed-door meeting rooms at Bercy, the headquarters of France's Ministry of the Economy and Finance, trade officials are debating whether to cap imports from Canada to protect domestic suppliers. Some ministers warn that if the flow of goods from 3. Germany, the precision shift. Dr. Elena Richter, a supply chain analyst for a major German automaker, stares at a spreadsheet she would have sworn was impossible just 6 months ago. The columns are glowing green. Her company has shifted 40% of its North American parts orders from U.S. suppliers to Canada. Canada's exports to Germany have climbed as German automakers and engineering firms realize Canadian suppliers are both reliable and price competitive. The results are striking. Germany's trade deficit with the U.S. fell from $7 billion in March to just $4 billion in June 2025, while imports from Canada surged by as much as 180%, according to data from Germany's Federal Statistical Office. Canadian manufacturers understand precision, Elena explained during a strategy meeting in Stuttgart. They meet our quality standards, deliver on time, and have a collaborative spirit, unlike some U.S. suppliers who used to take our contracts for granted. The executives nodded, with several already making plans to open representative offices in Toronto and Montreal. But Elena's confidence is about to be tested. The Port of Hamburg has just announced that customs clearance times for Canadian cargo are up by 36 hours due to a sudden surge in shipments. Infrastructure bottlenecks in Montreal are forcing container ships to wait for days for a docking slot, creating a domino effect that reaches all the way to Europe. The just-in-time production model Elena spent years perfecting depends entirely on deliveries timed to the hour. A single late component means a 400 cars per day assembly line comes to a halt. Then came the email from procurement, the kind that makes your stomach tighten. A U.S. supplier who had lost a contract to Canada is now offering a 25% discount plus guaranteed priority delivery, a deal the company had never seen before. The finance leadership is now asking Elena whether they should rediversify to reduce risk. She knows. 4. The Netherlands, a gamble on crude. At a refinery in Rotterdam, engineer Jan Vanderberg is overseeing the most expensive gamble of his career. Massive storage tanks shudder slightly as heavy crude from Alberta begins flowing through a newly upgraded pipeline system. Canada has ramped up crude oil exports to the Netherlands as local refineries rush to modify their equipment to handle this unique grade. The conversion costs are staggering, $2.3 billion for new heat exchangers, desulfurization units, and stronger heating systems. But to the board, the alternative, staying dependent on increasingly unstable and costly U.S. energy, is even worse. The challenge is this: Canadian crude has a completely different sulfur content and viscosity compared to North Sea oil or U.S. light crude. Dutch refineries, originally designed for lighter, cleaner oil, now have to learn how to process a feedstock that's tougher, more corrosive, and demands much higher heat. It's like teaching an old engine to run on a completely different fuel, Jan explained to a delegation of European energy ministers. In theory, it works, but in practice, it takes patience, money, and a bit of luck. The technical challenge is only part of the story. According to Reuters, Canadian crude has long been a key supply for U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest, and has been steadily gaining market share along the Gulf Coast. But as more of that flow gets pulled toward Europe, U.S. refineries are starting to face feedstock shortages, forcing them to seek pricier replacements from Latin America or the Middle East. Jan has no idea that behind closed doors in Washington, U.S. officials are discussing ways to nudge Canada into redirecting oil flows back to the domestic market, from tax incentives to diplomatic pressure. If they succeed.
5. Singapore, the financial hub. In the bustling financial hub of Singapore, trade finance specialist Li Wei is handling deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In just one day, Li processes more Canadian trade transactions than she used to see in an entire month. Singapore's position as Southeast Asia's financial center makes it a natural gateway for Canada's pivot toward Asia. While Singapore's trade surplus with the U.S. stood at a modest $0.2 billion in April 2025, Canadian trade transactions routed through Singaporean banks have soared 400% since February. The numbers are staggering. According to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, the value of Canadian letters of credit handled by Singaporean banks has jumped from $200 million a month to $2.8 billion. Lee's team works around the clock, arranging financing for timber exports to Vietnam, tech shipments to Thailand, and agricultural goods headed to Indonesia.
6. Thailand, a new partner. In Bangkok, James Morrison, the representative for Export Development Canada, EDC, has just closed the biggest deal since opening his office there in January 2025. This deal not only shattered his personal record but also pushed EDC Bangkok ahead of even the London office in total transaction value after just 6 months of operation. Since the start of 2025, EDC Bangkok has helped secure over $100 million in contracts as Thai manufacturers begin turning to Canada for everything from clean technology to agricultural machinery. According to customs data, Canadian agricultural exports to Thailand are up 23%, while clean tech components have risen 16% compared to the same period last year. One clear example is a $12 million deal between Tamura, a Vancouver-based company, and a major industrial equipment manufacturer in Thailand. In a video call with Ottawa, James explained, Thai manufacturers are looking to break free from dependence on Chinese suppliers. They see Canada as a trustworthy partner, aligned with the technology and environmental standards required by their export markets. But success brings pressure. Just like Canada, Thailand's logistics infrastructure isn't ready for the massive trade flow with North America. Container shipments are increasingly running late, and Lame Chabang port now has long queues of vessels waiting to unload. Meanwhile, some Thai companies that rushed to integrate Canadian components into their production lines have run into quality issues, forcing process adjustments. Then came a secure message from a diplomatic contact in Ottawa that made James' blood run cold. Chinese officials are quietly pressuring Thai manufacturers, warning them to be cautious about expanding cooperation with Canada. Some are even being promised financial incentives to maintain a certain percentage of Chinese components in their products. James knows this is no longer just about trade. The Thai market has become a Vietnam, the tri-country connection. Back at the port of Halifax, Michelle Dubois looks up at the largest container ship she has ever seen. Its hull is as long as a 50-story building laid on its side. 6 months ago, she had never even heard the name Haiphong, but now it shows up on the scheduling board almost every week. Vietnam has become the port's largest destination after the United States in terms of shipping volume. Vietnam became the second country to reach a trade agreement with the Trump administration when, on July 2, tariffs on Vietnamese exports to the U.S. were reduced from 46% to 20%. But the real boost came from a different direction. Since February, Canadian exports to Vietnam have surged by 290%. According to Statistics Canada, Vietnamese companies have signed contracts to import wood, steel, agricultural products, and technology components from Canada worth a total of $4.2 billion through 2026. Wedged between the U.S.'s harsh tariffs and China's supply chain risks, Vietnam sees Canada as a third path, safer, more stable, and less politically risky. Every day is a new challenge, Michelle said as she watched workers struggle to load cargo onto the massive ship bound for Ho Chi Minh City. We're shipping to Vietnam instead of Detroit and having to use Asian shipping routes that our logistics software has never even been programmed for. But the biggest paradox is unfolding quietly. Chinese manufacturers have been quick to exploit Vietnam as a transshipment hub to avoid heavy tariffs when exporting directly to the U.S. This intricate process sees Canadian goods arriving in Vietnam to be processed, assembled, or refined, then sold back to Chinese factories, and finally exported as finished products to the U.S. at significantly lower tariff rates. Michelle has no idea she has become a key link in the most complex triangle supply chain in modern trade history. It's a system in which a single broken link, a tax change, a port bottleneck, or